Hey Denchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and welcome to my review of the 7th studio album from the Canadian producer Haywyre. This one's called Twofold Part 2. Now in case you're new here, you probably even don't remember, I featured Twofold Part 1 as one of my top 10 albums of 2014, and for the most part that was and still is a fantastic album with very bright sounding EDM, glitch hop, trap type of music, and overall just extremely experimental and something that I had never heard before, maybe other than the couple house tracks that were featured on that. Now, while I was starting to hear some of the singles from Twofold Part 2, I was actually getting a little disappointed, thinking this in no way is a continuation of Twofold Part 1. And I was right. Now the thing is, these albums so heavily contrast each other that they're finally somehow able to fit together, to my knowledge. With Twofold Part 1, we get this really bright artwork surrounded by the beauty of nature, whereas there's this orb in the center that's supposed to kind of represent a man-made image, and the outside, which is the mountains, are supposed to represent more of a nature view. And with Twofold Part 2, the artwork is much more man-made, it seems like, as evidenced by the fact that it's illustrated for one, and the fact that you see the orb and the tree in the center, which is supposed to represent nature this time, rather than the orb representing machinery like before, and surrounded by civilization. Now I think that's the first step in understanding how these albums contrast each other so much, where we got such a happy sound, not necessarily happy on all the tracks, but for most of them on Twofold Part 1, and with Part 2 we're getting a lot darker and more complex for Haywyre, and probably some of the most different stuff he's made to date. Another cool concept about this album that someone pointed out on the Monster Cat Reddit is that these tracks seem to be grouped in twos, which I think is really cool. We start off with I Am Me and I Am You, which are obviously supposed to be connected, continuing into probably the least two connected tracks, Restrain and Impulse. Do You Don't You is a standalone house track that seems to contrast itself. We get Moment and Memory, which heavily contrast each other in styles, but have a very similar vocal chop that's used throughout both the tracks. And then we get Transient and Endlessly, and one's just this really epic piano interlude, and Endlessly is this really bright kind of Haywyre standard. Even the names themselves, Transient kind of means a short frame of time, and Endlessly is obviously a much longer frame of time. So throughout all these concepts, we're getting something much more interesting than I've ever seen from Haywyre before on any of his albums. I do have a few of them, have not listened through a lot of his earlier work, but he has been getting better and better since his Voyage album. This thing seems to be much more diverse overall than what we got with Twofold Part 1, which is very impressive. Although there are some small spots where we're just getting interludes on this one, I think it has about the same running length as Twofold Part 1. I've already bought this because it's so good. And if you just listen through it, if you try to go through this thing listening to it in twos, I think you're going to enjoy this thing a lot more and kind of feel this concept of the much darker machinery that this album's supposed to center around, opposed to Twofold 1. Just like to point out some of my highlights from the album. I Am You, one of those ones that features a really cool kind of drop, whereas the lead synth or lead melody kind of seems to be a little bit out of key, which I thought was an interesting choice. Impulse is just super minimal and kind of takes on fully the concept of this record with that really dark minimal sound. I was actually pretty hyped for this album when Do You Don't You dropped on Monster Cat, because it's a house track obviously, and I don't typically see that from Haywyre other than a couple tracks like I said on Twofold 1, also including his Odessa remix that came out last year. And this one's just super catchy. It's got some awesome bass lines in this, and one of the more interesting house tracks I've heard thus far this year. Moment is also another highlight on this, along with its sister track Memory. Moment being a little bit interesting, one for its key change toward the end of the track, which actually I think improved it, changing into that key and kind of taking this minimal style in a similar fashion as Impulse, and Memory really taking this really funky, awesome track that really contrasts Moment. Transient, although I never like to say the interlude tracks or like intro type of tracks are my favorites, this one absolutely is one of my favorites. It did impress me quite a bit more than Prologue Part 1 did, which was actually one of my favorites from Twofold 1. This one takes a much darker approach to the kind of sound we were getting in that, where there was just a super happy piano line leading into the schism. With this one, we're getting a much darker piano line with really dark elements kind of flowing through the background and then flowing perfectly into Endlessly, which very fittingly for the end of the album makes a really solid ending. Didn't like Endlessly, honestly, when it dropped as a single as much as I liked some of Haywyre's past singles in the last year, such as Insight, which is possibly my favorite song that Haywyre's ever dropped. I think a couple of his last singles, like Ever Changing and Insight, could have possibly fit onto this album, but I think with the concept he was going for, they had their place being off this one, and I'm happy that he chose to order the album the way that he did. I've been listening to this one straight on repeat, and now that I have such more of a grasp of how the concept of this record is, although I wasn't crazy about it originally, I am pretty much crazy about it now. Didn't love tracks like I Am You. This album is pretty friggin' fresh, and will be on repeat for a long time. So I think the most fair rating I can give this one is an 8.5. I think it did quite a bit outdo Twofold 1, and hopefully this one will make my top 10 albums of the year this year. Not saying I hope that there isn't a lot of good music to come out this year, but I just think this one is so good, and if you're wondering why I didn't give it higher, I'm really trying to tone down on how high I give ratings this year, as evidenced by my Eric Prydz album review. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this review. Let me know what you think in the comments. Suggest any albums in the near future you might want me to review. I'm coming up with a few more very soon. And anyway, I'll see you guys later. Peace.